in which we highlight the work and accomplishments of members of Central Reform Congregation. CRC has a remarkable number of people who have distinguished themselves in various ways, from the arts and sciences to our community's life, and in a number of other ways. In this program, we try to make you more aware of those people. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to Roger Goldman. Next month, on July 15th, I'll be talking with Jessica Hentoff, the founder and artistic executive director of Circus Harmony, which teaches circus arts and life skills to children, mostly from low-income backgrounds. But about Roger, let me start by saying that perhaps many of you know that only one person has ever won 2 unrelated Nobel Prizes. That was Linus Pauling, who won both for chemistry and for peace. Tonight, I am not prepared to nominate Roger for even one Nobel Prize, but I am going to say that he's one of the few people who could be interviewed in our midst for 2 entirely different sets of accomplishments. The first reason we could be interviewing Roger is because in the mid-1980s, he and his wife, Stephanie Riven, were among the very small group of people who started CRC, and Roger became our first president. But we're not going to talk about that tonight. Instead, we're going to talk to Roger about an entirely different subject, one that has gripped the whole country over the last several years, and that is police reform. Let me get a little bit more specific about Roger. Roger is an emeritus professor of law at St. Louis University, where he taught constitutional law primarily, with great distinction, from 1971 to 2014. While teaching at St. Louis U, Roger emerged as the leading expert in the country, not St. Louis, not Missouri, but the country, on the issue of licensing and delicensing police. You'll hear more about this in a moment, but it all started when Roger got interested in the question of why a police officer who had been fired in Maplewood was able to get on with another department in suburban St. Louis, where he got in more trouble. The problem later became known as the issue of wandering police officers. Roger figured out a long time ago that the best way to address this problem would be to create a system in which police could lose their licenses or certificates, the words are used interchangeably, to be police officers. For nearly 40 years now, he's been waging a crusade to get states to enact laws and programs to make that possible. And he's had a great deal of success, especially in recent years, as policing in America has become a hotter and hotter issue. Partly as a result, Roger has become a nationally prominent figure in the area of police reform. This past March, I sat down with Roger in his home to interview him about all of this for another project. What we're going to do tonight is play that interview first and then open the program to your questions. The interview lasts 35 minutes. Please stay with us. And if questions occur to you as you're listening, type them out in the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen. As soon as the recorded interview is over, we'll start putting those questions to Roger. One last detail before we begin. You will hear a reference in this interview to a man named Mike Wolff. For those of you who are not familiar with that name, he is Dean Emeritus of the St. Louis University School of Law and former Chief Justice of the Missouri Supreme Court. So his words carry weight. Okay, it's time for the interview. Let's roll it. And then again, we'll come back on at the end of it in 35 minutes and we'll take your questions. Thank you.
I'm Paul Wagman, and I'm here in the living room of Roger L. Goldman, a living room where I've spent a lot of time over the years. 41 years ago, this past Saturday, March 20th, 2 bullets from a policeman's revolver tore through the body of an alleged car thief in a parking lot in Maplewood. The shots killed the alleged thief, but they triggered an epiphany for a still youthful St. Louis University law professor. The dead man, Roy Walsh, and the man who shot him, the late Joseph D. Cerbelo, have both likely been forgotten by everyone except their families. But the law professor turned his epiphany into a lifelong mission that has made him a national figure in the circles of law enforcement. And never has that celebrity burned brighter than it has in the last 12 months in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing by a Minnesota police officer. The New York Times last June 24th offered up the professor's words as its quote of the day. The Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the Yale Law Journal, CNN, among other outlets, have seen fit to interview him or to cite his writings. State legislators and reporters and law enforcement and civil liberties officials all over the country have sought his insights and recommendations. Roger L. Goldman, now 79, and for the last 5 years, Callis Family Professor of Law at St. Louis University, has become the Adam Wainwright of the academic law set. Given the focus, duration, and the impact of his single-minded crusade, not to mention his initials, RLG, one might even call him notorious. Let me start by asking you if you remember that epiphany 41 years ago, and what exactly, were your thoughts when you realized that this man, Cerbelo, who had killed this fellow who supposedly was trying to steal his car, was the same Joseph Cerbelo that you'd read about 3 years earlier in the Post-Dispatch? Try to explain your train of thought to us.
Well, Paul, the Cerbelo had been at the Maplewood Police Department, and he would engage in acts that we just wouldn't believe, including playing Russian roulette with suspects, sticking a gun down a suspect's throat and say, suck on it. And for those kinds of misconduct, he was fired, but was ended up being hired at another department called Bridgeton Terrace in small municipality in St. Louis County. For those of you who know how many small police departments have existed in St. Louis County, 90 municipalities, each one had their own police department.
Right.
And the police chief at Bridgeton Terrace knew what he had done at Maplewood, but nonetheless hired him because at that time, there was no ability for the state, there was no state law that authorized the state licensing agency called POST, Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, to take away the license of someone like Cerbelo who had committed those acts at Maplewood. So there he was hired at Bridgeton Terrace.
Right.
He'd been fired from Maplewood.
Just 3 years prior.
3 years prior. So went back to Maplewood, where he was now working as a salesman, where he sees this fellow Wash sitting in his car and thought he was going to steal it. And with that weapon that he had from Bridgeton Terrace,
right,
that was the weapon that then shot and killed Wash.
Right.
And what I then realized was, how could it be that someone who had done that kind of act could still be employed as a police officer? That then led me on my determination to find out, well, how did other states address this issue? And I got a grant from St. Louis U to go to Florida to study how their licensing agency handled it.
Why Florida, Roger?
Because they were the most active in this, it turns out, this ability to remove the license of an unfit officer.
I see.
And so I then came back to St. Louis. I was very involved with the local ACLU and worked with Sheila Lumpy, who was a state rep, and Joyce Armstrong, who was the head of the ACLU at the time. And we proposed a bill through Sheila Lumpy that was signed by then Governor Ashcroft, which authorized the Missouri Department of Public Safety to take away the license or decertify officers who'd committed serious misconduct.
Okay, let's get to that in a minute. I think that shortly before you did all that great work in Missouri, it's my understanding that first you did what a law professor is supposed to do. You wrote a law review article, which summarized all the research you'd done in Florida about Florida and about other states. And I actually have some notes on that article, but I mean, it was an extraordinarily comprehensive review of the avenues that were open to municipalities and states to decertify policemen, or I should say police officers, because they can be women, but to decertify, to get rid of them. And what you found was that it was very rare for anyone to lose the opportunity to get rehired somewhere else, because there was very little decertification going on. And that it was very uncommon for police departments to successfully investigate their own police officers for misconduct. They were always exonerated, which is still the case, just about. And that when people brought lawsuits or criminal charges against policemen, they never won. And so therefore your conclusion was, and this is in your article that you wrote in 1987 for the Hastings Law Review. There, yeah. You remember it. The Hastings Law Review. Decertification offers perhaps the best chance for states to take responsibility for removing unfit police officers from the profession. So you, in 1987, you said, this is the way to go. Decertification, we've got to beef up decertification. And then you went to Missouri and said, to Sheila Lumpy, and said, let's get a new law that allows decertification. So you had the solution 38 years ago, Roger.
Yeah, I have. That tells me I've been working on this a long time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you're right. Things have changed a lot since then, particularly with incidents like George Floyd and similar incidents in other states where a particularly egregious case, like playing Russian roulette with a suspect, will lead the states to decide just firing an officer is not enough, because that person could be rehired again. And unless you have decertification, you'll just let that person, the term today is used as a wandering officer. Officers who do something bad at one department get fired, but if they're not decertified, they just resurface again at another department, typically a smaller department, like in Bridgeton Terrace.
Right. So you worked with Sheila and Joyce Armstrong, you mentioned, and Clarence Harmon, I think you told me once.
Yes, Clarence Harmon was the, later became police chief, but at the time I knew him, he was head of internal affairs, and he's the one who testified in favor of the bill. As head of the internal affairs at the city Metropolitan Police Department in St. Louis City, he said people that he had fired or who quit would very often resurface again at a small county department. He said in 90% of the cases that would occur. And so he was a very effective person to testify before the legislature. And in 1988, Governor Ashcroft signed the bill passing the statute that authorized decertification in Missouri.
And Roger, you're a modest guy, so I'm going to quote for you from the Post-Dispatch, June 29th, 1988. It said, it pointed out that the law was the result of efforts by Lumpy and Harmon, and it said, quote, their interest in the legislation had been sparked by Roger L. Goldman, who said he had been studying procedures for revocation of certification in other states for years. So the Post gave you credit all those years ago. And it even referred to your article in the Hastings Law Review, which I will wager is the only time ever that the Hastings Law Review got cited in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Unless you wrote another article for the Hastings Law Review that I don't know about.
No.
And as a result, the things got better in Missouri. I mean, not great, but substantially better. You told me that between 1988 and 2015, that Missouri has decertified about 1,000 officers, which was more than all but in 7 other states.
Right. So Missouri, which doesn't have that many officers compared to other states, has really done an outstanding job in terms of its decertification of unfit officers.
Yeah, fancy that. So then you went on, as my understanding, after you got Missouri under your belt, you went on to Illinois and Indiana.
Right. I talked to a former student of mine who was a state representative in the Illinois legislature and said Illinois needs to have a law like this. And soon thereafter, they did get a decertification law. In fact, Governor Pritzker just signed a strengthening of that law.
Yeah.
And then I also went to the Indiana Police Training Academy on my own one day and said they needed to have it, and they passed a law. So ever since then, I've been bothering, you could say, other states, and have worked in the state of Washington. Massachusetts just passed a law, and several other states as well. So you use the word crusade, Paul. It's truly been what I have been doing for the last however many years you said, 50 years or so, working on this issue.
Roger, I want to read to you what the comments that Mike Wolff made to me about your efforts. He was there. I think they're worthy of quotation here. I called Mike to talk to him about you, and he said that I'm just going to read to you what he said. He said, most authors of a brilliant law review article, he's referring to your Hastings article, stand back and wait for the world to respond. But it rarely does. Roger perceived that you not only have to have the intellectual construct, you have to sell it. He bridged the gap between ideas and policy. And in that regard, and in his persistence, he deserves to be described with a word that usually annoys me, but which fits in this case: unique. As he said, part of the reason you've been able to, part of the reason you've succeeded in getting so many more states involved in these efforts is that he said he's very logical. He is not confrontational. He doesn't make people who disagree with him feel stupid. Far from it. He's a good Socratic teacher who makes his listener feel smart by the end of the exchange. I think that's that certainly rings true for me, Roger. You, as hard as I might want to feel stupid, you've never made me feel stupid.
That would be impossible to make you stupid.
Anyway, so you start off with these Midwestern states,
Right.
And then I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of the way I look at it, the next sort of big thing that happened in your career here was that episode in 1992 in West Palm Beach, Florida, and that got you on Dateline. Can you tell that story?
Yes. What had happened in West Palm Beach was that two officers, one had come from Chattanooga, who had some problems there in Tennessee, and the other one had committed serious misconduct in a small department, I think called Riviera Beach in Florida.
You're not far from West Palm Beach.
Not far from West. And
yeah.
Both of those officers who'd done some terrible things, the chief in West Palm, when called the chief at Riviera Beach and then the commissioner at Chattanooga, they did not disclose the serious misconduct that those officers had done. And so what you could see that is the problem there is that not only is there a problem of an officer like in the Cerbelo case who's in the same state who misbehaves, but you have interstate problems like the person from Chattanooga
right.
coming to this other department. And so that's when I got interested not just in decertification, but the need for some kind of a data bank that could share this misconduct so other states would know about that serious misconduct.
Right. And what happened in West Palm Beach was that those two bad apples beat a guy to death.
Yeah.
I think it was a hitchhiker.
Yeah, it was a hitchhiker, and they were acquitted. And the acquittal of those officers is what caused Florida then to strengthen its decertification law, and also got Congress interested in perhaps a national data bank that would track this kind of misbehavior. So I would say my dual interest has been in getting a data bank that would track obviously unfit officers, but at the federal level, but then at the state level, also making sure there's decertification. And indeed, there is now a data bank that's run by the directors of the state licensing agency called the National Decertification Index, and I made a recommendation for the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that was Obama's task force, that the Department of Justice partner with the NDI, and that recommendation hasn't been implemented, but I have a feeling that one day it will be, that the Justice Department will get involved in, just that like we have it now for doctors, we need a similar one for police officers.
But you, in 92, when you were on Dateline, you said, this is in the transcript, that what happened in West Palm Beach, quote, was avoidable. And I'm sure we're going to have many more avoidable deaths like this until we in society say it's time to take this problem seriously. And so you very soberly predicted everything that was going to happen, you know, that finally in the last few years, you know, has begun to produce really sweeping results. But you called it again, you know.
Well, to me, it's so obvious, so I don't want to pat myself too much on the back. When you think of every other profession that have much less power than officers who can carry guns and use deadly force, we regulate hairdressers, we regulate real estate salesmen. So why in the world wouldn't we do the same for law enforcement officers? And by the way, not just police officers, but corrections officers. And today, several states do both. Probation officers, 9/11 operators. Oregon even decertifies private security guards. So I think now most states are on the track to only, I think 4 states now don't. 4 or 5 states don't decertify.
Well, maybe this is the time to ask you then, what is the answer? Why was it simply an oversight all these years, or was it the influence of the police unions?
Yeah, police unions have a lot of power, although most police unions don't want to have really bad apples with them. But it's hard, my sense is it's hard to run for office as a union officer for more regulation. But again, since virtually every state now, since I started, only maybe 15 states were decertifying, and now we're up to, I think it's 46 that are.
Yeah.
So we're definitely making progress. But I think ultimately all of them will.
Actually, the number was higher. When you started, it was 30. You could say it was 37. The fact is, though, that of those 37, very few were actually doing very much at all in the way of decertification.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Some states that have decertification on the book are actually not enforcing it. And the other thing is some of the laws are quite weak. They only decertify if the officer's been convicted of a crime as opposed to committing the offense. And we certainly wouldn't do that for any other profession. We disbar lawyers short of committing a crime. So it's one thing to have the law on the books, but it's the other thing to make it a strong law. And that's really been what my effort is.
Right. So it's my sense, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my sense you started off with your cause being, okay, we've got to set up a mechanism for decertifying police officers, a mechanism that works. But then it's to some extent your effort morphed into let's professionalize the police effort, and let's establish higher standards to get that certification in the first place, and then let's establish lower standards to decertify them. You know, let's make it not that you have to commit a felony. Let's make it reasonable. If you do something that should disqualify you, even if it wasn't a felony, then decertify. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's clearly not enough. In fact, both Illinois has just recently passed such a law, and so has Massachusetts, that would make it not just the conviction of a felony, but the commission of an act that leads to serious misconduct. For example, an example that would be Webster Groves once had officers who were having sex with teenage girls in hot tubs while on duty. Well, they weren't convicted of anything, but because at the time that happened, these people were discharged from Webster Groves, but they were hired by neighboring departments. But thank goodness Missouri had decertification.
After it had been in the paper?
After it had been in the paper, and they were hired. But thanks for the fact that we had a strong decertification law, those officers who committed it while on duty were decertified. But I did want to get back to one thing, Paul, you said, that these licensing agencies, both certify, that is, they're going to check on what the qualifications and misconduct was before the officers joined the force, like you do for people applying to the bar, and then also having a serious training standards. So there's both making sure they meet minimum qualifications, serious training standards, including both, basic, like a bar exam equivalent, going through police academy, but then also decertification. So it's certification, decertification, and training, just like we do for every other profession. So we're on the cusp of every state, almost every state, getting to that where we've been. So it's been a lifetime of work, and I hope my contributions have helped push us in that direction. But it is interesting, Paul, for the states that don't have them. They tend to be progressive states. California, which regulates virtually every profession, doesn't have decertification for police officers. It used to, only if you're convicted of a felony. But now there are bills being introduced in California. So again, I'm hopeful. Again, it's largely because of police unions that it's failed. But now even police unions are seeing the need, not objecting to decertification.
And I suppose, some of it clearly has been driven, some of the progress has been driven by the fact that so many of these abuses are now caught on video. We saw Walter Scott gunned down in South Carolina, right? And I don't know, is Tommy Rice, was that case, that was on video too, wasn't it?
I don't know if it was on video, but the terrible thing about Tamir Rice, the young boy in California who was pointing a tow gun at the officer.
He was in Ohio.
Yeah, Cleveland. He'd been at another department before that, and that department had, Independence, Ohio, had in the record how terrible he was. He would weep on the firing range. This guy's name was Timothy Lohman. But because Cleveland never checked, and their decertification law was very weak, it didn't require them to check. Now some states are saying not only do we have to decertify, but states have to query previous departments where he came from. And if they had known what he'd done at Independence, they never would have hired him. So it's not just the decertifications being strengthened, but things like background checks and checking. So there's a whole lot that goes into how do you get a really strong, effective decertification law.
Well, one of the things that happened in the course of your 41-year crusade is that, then we just talked about Timothy Rice and Walter Scott, but those were shortly after, of course, Michael Brown. And one of the ironies of this whole situation is that in 2014, okay, so we talked about what happened in 1992 with Dateline, and then you made some quiet progress around the country, but then things really started to flare up again in 2014, when first Eric Garner is killed in July, I think, in New York, where he's I can't breathe, and with the chokehold. And then Michael Brown, and the irony, of course, of Michael Brown is that it occurs only a few miles from your office and your home. And so here's the national media coming down to report on the Brown case. And the guy who's been working on these issues for all these decades is right here. It's you.
Yeah, and let me pick up on that, because you mentioned these excessive force cases, but I got a call from the AP related to Michael Brown. And I said to them, you really need to write about decertification and to speak, if this is effective. And they did a story that showed over a 6-year period that they'd researched 1,000 officers have been decertified for sexual misconduct. So in terms of the kind of conduct that results in it isn't just excessive force, but they found that of those 1,000 officers decertified, many of them were involved with sexual misconduct with trafficked girls, minors, and victims of crime. Someone calls the 911, the police officer comes over, my husband just beat me up, and the officer then has sex with her. And I had found that same thing when I did my original research in Florida in that Hastings Law Journal article, that most of the cases that involved abuse of citizens were acts of sexual misconduct. So it's not just excessive force, that's what people tend to think of, but decertification can work in so many other areas as well.
Yes, and once again, Roger, this puts you ahead of your time in a way, because this is a few years before the Me Too movement comes along.
Yes.
So you're identifying what turns out to be even more prevalent kind of abuse
Right.
that no one had talked about before at all.
Yes.
And you're saying this is actually the most common, and it's still, actually, it still doesn't get as much attention, obviously.
Right.
Well, one can understand.
I'd written an op-ed piece for Newsweek on
Right.
that point, the Me Too movement and sexual misconduct by police. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you also, around this time, maybe it was I guess it was a year or two later, you helped some news organization and do a study of law enforcement in Minnesota that turned out to be prescient too. Do you know what I'm talking about? You remember what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
I had was interviewed extensively by the Minneapolis Star Tribune, I think it was called, because their law on decertification was quite weak. It was one that required a felony convictions or like the others. And so they're working at strengthening their laws in Minnesota.
Yeah, and this is 2017, meaning it's 3 years before George Floyd. And once again, you turned out to be prophetic by saying that, let's see, you said that Minnesota was actually, was in trouble because their laws were too weak and they were not disciplining and ridding themselves of problem officers. And then in 2020, we had it right in Minneapolis, we had the George Floyd case. Yeah. The Star Tribune editorialized after its series in which you'd helped them that the state had a state licensing system that is failing repeatedly to hold officers accountable for reckless, sometimes violent conduct. Yeah, and Chauvin, the officer in the Floyd case, had in fact been charged with such conduct by a few people,
right,
some of his victims.
And that may come up in the trial. It'll be interesting to see if that evidence is going to be admissible. And I think it will be a pattern of conduct by him.
So you've been proved right a number of times, Roger. Have you ever been proved wrong? And I'm going to include Stephanie in that conversation.
No, but as I say, it would just, again, seem so obvious. We do with so many other professions that its time has come, Paul, pretty clearly.
Yeah. But you have to give yourself credit, Roger. You're the one who pointed out that it was obvious. I mean, if it was obvious to you, but no one else it either wasn't as obvious to others, or they were simply not following up on the fact that it was obvious.
Yeah. Well, I think one reason was in terms of civil libertarians generally and people who comment on police misconduct, there's a tendency to think it only can be solved at the U.S. Supreme Court level or by federal, but these are state laws. So the last article I wrote was something on the importance of state laws and police reform. So I've been an advocate, because in law school, you just learn about the importance of federal courts,
right.
But really it's the states that regulate police, and that's where the efforts have to come from. And so in that sense, I was a little unusual in pushing for the role of states.
So it's like in politics, where it turns out the states have a lot of power that
right.
the Democrats weren't paying attention to.
Yeah, you got it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think you've told me that the other thing that sort of, it would be very natural for you, Roger, to feel a great thrill about all of the progress that's been made recently and all the attention that you've gotten. I mean, you're human. Mark Twain said he could live for a month on a good compliment. You've had a lot of good compliments, in the last year. Some of them explicit, some of them implicit. The implicit one simply being that, your name is getting used in all these top flight publications. You have the quote of the day in the New York Times, et cetera. But I think one of the things that you said that has restrained your sense of your thrill is that you know that your work has also been based on tragedy. I mean, that it's, why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, it's these outrageous cases that bring it to the fore. And I'd like to joke that, look, I wasn't responsible for Michael Brown's death or Floyd, but it just makes it obvious that why something is needed. So, I can't pat myself too much on the back for what seems to me self-evident.
Well, nonetheless, Roger, I would be hard pressed to name another law professor in the St. Louis, certainly in the St. Louis area, and maybe a handful in the whole country who've had the impact that you've had.
Well, it's something that Mike Wolff sort of hinted at, which is I've always viewed myself as an educator, but as an advocate. And sometimes those two things don't come together. You're supposed to be scholarly, but I want to be scholarly in the real world. So in a way, given my background with the ACLU and in involvement in human rights and civil liberties for all these years, it was sort of inevitable that my career in law would be that combination of advocacy and scholarship. You really need both.
It's a natural blend for you.
Right,
yeah,
right.
I hadn't really put that together before, but yes, the whole rest of your life reflects that activist part of you. Well, Roger, I think I can't think of any other questions at the moment to ask you. Is there anything else that comes to mind in this discussion that we haven't talked about?
Well, I just hope that those few states that don't have decertification and the states that have it but so weak that whoever views this our conversation will realize what one person can do to push for this. And I would just urge people to consider this, because again, it's off of most people's radar screen. Who's ever heard of decertification before? That we should, anytime, a horrendous case comes up, like the Cerbelo one, and your state doesn't have a way of dealing with that, push for it. Because again, one person can make a difference.
Well, you've certainly made a difference. And that does bring to mind another question. Tell us a little bit about how you operated. I mean, I know that you made a lot of public appearances. You went to conferences. But you also just did a lot of phone work, didn't you? You cultivated reporters on the phone. You cultivated legislators on the phone or in person. I mean, you just reached out to people almost like a salesman or a reporter, trying to drum up a campaign.
Yeah, no, that's it. Because again, if you just write the article, that's not going to be enough, as Mike Wolff suggested. So you have to get over your modesty. And what I would particularly do is if I saw an article written about some horrendous case, as I saw in Hawaii, I, on vacation, just wrote the Senate Majority Leader, who I heard would be interested in police misconduct, met in his office, and the result of that was an introduction of a bill that would get decertification in Hawaii. So again, and I tell that to young faculty colleagues that, definitely write your articles, but if you've got something to say, you're your own best salesman, if you will. And we don't usually think of academics doing that.
No, not at all.
But I think it's, really important. And, getting your academic work out there into the real world. I mean, after all, to me, that's been what my life has been about.
Yeah. Did you have to overcome a certain amount of shyness or
not really, because I would see an article in the paper and it was about the cop who did something bad, and I say, well, you do know your state doesn't have decertification, and then that would get them interested. How to do it. So again, it's not something you think of academics doing, but it again came naturally to me.
Well, congratulations on your impact. When you started, 37 states, and most of them doing really nothing. and now 46 states with something on the books, and many of them increasingly aggressive and showing they now understand what has to be done.
And let me just notice how you said states. That's really been my work has been. I'm now urging federal law enforcement agencies that, can be known to, like the Border Patrol, harassing women coming across there, that they start to do it. My understanding is a couple of federal agencies have, by regulation now, adopted certification and decertification standards. And if we're going to do it for state agencies, why shouldn't we be doing it for federal agencies as well? So I think that's my next goal, is to push the federal government. And there has been some interest ever since George Floyd in some bills that have been introduced for doing just that, both data banks and certifying and decertifying federal officers, law enforcement officers.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so there's still more
to
be done.
Right.
Yeah, no rest for the weary.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. It's
Thank
been
you,
a great
Paul, for doing this.
conversation.
Well, Roger, let's see. Have I got you there? You there, Roj? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, Roger, let me follow up by asking you one or two other questions, and then please, those in the audience, if you do have questions, I had seen some in the Q&A, but now they seem to have vanished. So I don't currently have any audience questions. So I'll press ahead and ask you, Roger, where, since we talked, and that was in March, since we talked, have there been any important developments in this area? Have any states made additional progress for setting up licensing or delicensing?
California has enacted in one of its houses a decertification bill. As I mentioned, in Massachusetts, which didn't used to have one, now has one. My understanding is in New Jersey, a state that doesn't have it, their attorney general has been trying to increase the power of their post to decertify. So it's certainly on the radar screen of these other states. And so I am pretty confident, as I said in the interview, Paul, that all the states will get it, just because it's hard to argue, as I said in our interview, why would we decertify for these professions that don't have the kind of power that police do? So I think inevitably it's going to happen. Also at the federal level, the George Floyd Police Reform Act does have a provision which would have a database on cops who've committed serious misconduct. I think it's limited pretty much to the excessive force cases, but as I said in our interview, I think ultimately any serious misconduct ought to go on that database.
Right. And speaking of the George Floyd bill, Roger, my understanding, I know it's passed the House, it's now stalled in the Senate. Any forecast, you want to offer any forecast on whether or not that is going to get through in some form or fashion?
Well, my understanding is that Senator Booker and Tim Scott are getting close to it.
Oh, good.
The holdup there, I think, Paul, is going to be with one provision which would get rid of something called qualified immunity, which has the effect of letting police off who commit serious misconduct. But the Supreme Court had ruled in interpreting it in another situation that that a lot of this, what we would consider misconduct, doesn't constitute that. And it has allowed police off for doing a lot of serious misconduct. The other thing the bill would do, at least for federal officers, it would not allow chokeholds, the kind of thing that was used by Chauvin, or as in the Breonna Taylor case in Louisville, It would not allow these no-knock drug warrants.
Right.
And it would also provide money for training in states, especially funding of body cameras. So it seems pretty, those pretty obvious ideas, but whether it's going to get through to the Senate or not, I just don't know.
Roger, here we have a question from Jane Baker, who is asking, how effective is Missouri's decertification program? And assuming it needs strengthening, if it does need strengthening, what can lay people do to advocate for that?
Well, as I said, when you compare it to the other states, much bigger states, Missouri has really done a good job. One of the things that can use is more investigators, really budgetary questions. But the fact that it decertifies without requiring a criminal conviction is, it makes it a lot better than some of those weaker states. So that would be my push, would be to increase the budget because there are a lot of officers. You may have read some recently about coming from St. Anne and the problem of they call it the municipal shuffle, where I mentioned how Clarence Harmon noted that when city officers would go out to the county. And my understanding is that's still happening now too. So the need to beef up the investigative staff of the Department of Public Safety would be something that would be very worthwhile.
I see. St. Anne is a real problem area, is it not?
Yeah, it's been for a long time.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question from Facebook, Roger. The person writes, there's a high incidence of transgender victims. Is this hate crime, or does it involve possible police, conduct? I guess the question is, I think that perhaps what the person means is whether the police themselves are involved in crimes against transgender people. I believe that's the best I can make of.
Yeah, I think that's probably what the question is asking. It certainly is in other states. I'm not aware of it here. There's another problem with how to deal with persons exhibiting mental traumas, people who are addicted. And so that's one of the things that better training can do. And of course, racial profiling has traditionally been a problem as well. So that's just not in Missouri, but that is kind of a national problem, those things. So I think that's the thrust of the question.
Ray Slavin is asking an interesting question, Roger. He's asking, he's noting that you commented on the power of police unions, and he asks, what have you found to be the most effective way to bring them about to your way of thinking?
Well, Massachusetts, which is the state that hadn't had decertification, somehow was able to, in the legislature, bring the police unions into the conversation, and somehow was able to overcome their opposition. So with only 4 states left that don't have it, the unions are going to play a part, and somehow you have to bring them into it at the early stages. But it's not easy, although, as I say, I think it's getting, because now you can say, how is it that only 4 states don't have it, and other states, Florida, which has one of the strongest decertification programs, has very strong police unions. In fact, police unions serve on the state post board too. So it is possible. But one of the things I found is states that have very strong police officer Bill of Rights, gives police rights that others don't, also tend to have weak decertification laws. So you usually find states that have weak decertification laws also tend to give, through collective bargaining, a lot of strength to unions. So if you looked at the statistics of decertifications, you would see that the states with the fewest number tend to be in the Northeast, which might be surprising. You'd think that these progressive states would be better at doing decertification, but thanks at least to traditional opposition by unions, that's not been the case.
Right. Roger, this is an unrelated question in a way, but speaking of police unions, I mean, we have the very odd and ugly situation in the city of St. Louis of having basically a white police officers union and a black police officers union. How common is that across the country? Do you know?
I'm not sure how common it is, but there's been lots of allegations of racism in police departments around the country, I think they're called the Ethical Society of Police, has been very active in terms of pointing out problems at the departments. But to answer your question, I don't know what the statistics are nationally.
Right. Okay. Here's a question from John Wallace, who says, I'll just read the question as he wrote it. Taking into account the fact that many of the all but 4 states, in other words, the 46 states that have some sort of licensing program, that many of them have weak laws, about what number of states have strong decertification laws, Roger?
That's a good question. So John, the states that there was a survey taken in 2015, and it showed that the states with the most number of decertifications are in the Southeast: North Carolina, Florida, Georgia. Again, this would surprise you. When I used to teach criminal procedure, I would ask my students, what states do you think have weak decertification laws? And they all pointed to states in the South. And which do you think have the strong ones? They pointed to states in the North. And it's maybe because the lack of police union strength in the South, but again, it's not consistent with what you think, that you think blue states will be the ones with the strongest laws, and it's not. Although again, it's changing now that Massachusetts and New York aren't, which didn't until recently have laws, strong laws, and Illinois now has a stronger law that just came into effect a few months ago. So those are the states. And I'm hoping it changes now that Massachusetts has it, but again, it depends in the details in the laws, because you can have a state like Georgia has very few decertifications, and Louisiana, even though there's traditionally a lot of police misconduct. So it really depends on how the statute's worded, and I can tell you how effective their laws are going to be.
I see. All right, Roger, here's a question from Stuart Halpern. How would you anticipate a data bank preventing the interstate shuffle problem through an interstate compact, given that the feds do not have authority to to regulate state policies in regard to police?
So here's how it would work. My recommendation to the President's task force was the federal government has a database for healthcare professionals, so that any malpractice judgment or settlement, any sanctions imposed by the state health board, like nurses or anesthesiologists, will go in this database. And my view is if the Department of HHS, which runs that database, is doing this for doctors and healthcare professionals, certainly the DOJ, which has a long interest in stopping police misconduct, as the George Floyd case said, they would be able to set up this database and require states to report the misconduct. As a practical matter, though, we have 18,000 police departments at state, local, and county levels. And some of those departments are so strapped for money, I doubt they even have computers. So as a realistic matter, I'm wondering how that part of the George Floyd Act could be implemented. But as far as the power of the federal government, they can bring pattern and practice suits against states for unconstitutional conduct. They certainly could require states to report, misconduct involving people's, at least civil rights and civil liberties violations.
Right.
So that'll be very interesting to see if that part of the bill gets through. I think it's the most likely one to get through. Because if we do it for docs, why wouldn't we do it for cops?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to defend it. It's impossible. Another question from John Wallace. Is there any notable racial characteristic of decertified officers, or are these data not collected?
The data probably is collected. I've never seen it though, but one of the things that comes close to this though, John, is, I should have mentioned this before, a couple of states have a integrity bulletin, which lists exactly why an officer was decertified. For those of you who want to pursue it, just take a look for the integrity bulletins of Arizona and Oregon, and you'll actually see what it is cops are getting decertified for. I found a number in Arizona, just going through this, where the officers were decertified for racial comments, racial actions, like an Uber driver who was arrested and called a raghead, trying to get it, that discrimination against Muslims. And especially, I recall in Arizona, many examples like that. So just to see what it is people are getting decertified for, I think the audience might be interested in checking those out.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. No, we don't have any more questions now from the audience. So I'll ask one more, Roger.
Okay.
And it's one I'm sure that you have heard many times before, although it's not specifically to your area of expertise. But what do you think of the whole, defund the police movement? What are your thoughts about that?
Take a look what happened in Minneapolis, where that first defund movement was talked about. Who are the people most affected by not having police protection? It's not going to be Clayton and Ladue, because they won't defund. It's going to be places where people of color live, poor people live, where crime is rampant, and just go back and review some of how people change their minds about defunding the police in Minneapolis. I do think the idea of having some of the police functions taken over by social workers, people trained, or even the police could be trained in that. But my view has always been that we're not ready as a society yet to give up on police, but we should just strengthen laws like the Decertification, like the George Floyd Act, because I think this may be one of the situations where be careful what you wish for.
Right, Roger. Yeah, I know. Part of the problem with you, Roger, is that you make so much sense. It'd be frustrating. We do have no more questions, and our hour is up. And so I want to thank you, Roger, very much for your time tonight, and more importantly, for the 41 years that you have devoted to this cause. It's a really a fairly remarkable thing when somebody on their own identifies an issue that they think has not received enough attention, and then does the intellectual work and the campaigning needed to make change. And as you said, it's a cliche that one person can make a difference, and most of us don't believe it. But Roger, you've proved that it can be true. So on behalf of all of us at CRC, I think I could safely say thank you, and on behalf of everyone, thanks a lot for all your great work.
And, Paul, encourage any of the listeners to reach out to me if they have any questions, because I spent a few years on this. I've got a few more years to spend, and be happy to talk.
Very good.
Thanks for your work,
Roger.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.